flood risk is increasing. And climate change projections suggest increased frequency and severity over time. So one staggering statistic I want to tell you is that there were 18 separate events in 2022 that cost over $1 billion. And that's not just flood, that's all weather related events in the United States, but $1 billion times 18, that's staggering. And the frequency, not only in like all events, but in billion-dollar events is also increasing. So between 2017 and 2021, the US experienced a $1 billion disaster every 18 days on average. Pretty staggering. In the 1980s, the average time between those was 82 days. So you can see that they're happening now on average every 18 days versus every 82 days. That's $1 billion disasters, and that has been adjusted for inflation. So just consider that that's pretty staggering. So I think we all know that structures that are built to meet or exceed the NFIP minimum standards do incur less damage. The statistic is 65% less damage. That saves a lot of money for this country. That goes back into the economy. So avoided losses are a good thing. We all manage floodplain development in some way in part of this group, and we all manage that in different ways, but managing development is a proven way to reduce disaster losses. You do this already in a few ways. The NFIP minimum standards, the community rating system program if you participate, and I see some names that I recognize that do participate, and building codes, and especially building codes with higher standards, which we know Massachusetts does have some higher standards and some communities do as well. And then now FFRMS, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, is just a supplement to these things. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it applies to. So as Joy mentioned, FFRMS was established by executive order, specifically 13690, which was rescinded briefly and then reinstated by executive order 14030. It is a supplement.
Katie, hang on, we lost your sound for some reason. And it looks like she can't hear me saying that either. Noah, are you there? Maybe I lost the sound.
No, it's Katie.
I'm very sorry about that. Okay, I'm very sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So now I'm on a different source of audio. I clarified, but you may not have heard me. FFRMS supplements Executive Order 11988. It does not replace it. So you're still going to follow that 8-step process. FFRMS just adds some additional requirements and some clarification to 11988. So some of you may already be familiar with that. So the purpose of the flood risk management standard is to address that future and current flood risk for federal actions. And I will, on another slide, address federal actions. I'm going to turn off my camera because I'm having some connectivity issues. Okay. So we want to ensure that projects funded by taxpayer dollars last as long as intended. We don't want to keep investing taxpayer dollars into things that are just going to get washed away. So we accomplish that by expanding the management of the floodplain from the base flood elevation to a higher vertical flood elevation and corresponding horizontal floodplain. And there will be a diagram, don't worry. So federal action, I promised that I would define that. So that is acquiring, managing, disposing of federal lands and facilities, or providing federally undertaken, financed, or assisted construction and improvements, or conducting federal activities and programs affecting land use, including but not limited to water and related land resources, planning, regulating, and licensing activities. Basically, this isn't just, oh, there's a military base and they're doing work, so this applies to them, or oh, like the National Park Service is building a brand new visitor center and this only applies to them. This applies to anything that is funded in whole or part by federal dollars. So if you get a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency, Housing and Urban Development, FEMA, this is when this applies. So it's not just a federal agency building a project. It is anytime you get money. And as we all know, FEMA hands out a lot of money after disasters and for mitigation. So this applies if you have any of those grants, as well as grants for other federal agencies. So FFRMS, a lot of people are mistaking this as an elevation standard, like it's just about freeboard, but it's not just about that. It describes various approaches, which include a higher vertical elevation, but it also expands the floodplain horizontally. So it adds to the floodplain for federally funded projects. It's not an elevation standard, it's resilience. The increasing the vertical elevation just increases that resilience. So there are three approaches in Executive Order 13690 for FFRMS to establish the FFRMS floodplain. So one is the climate informed science approach. So that's using some best available data to determine, including climate change, to determine what the BFE to elevate to is. The second is the freeboard value approach, which is adding freeboard to the base flood elevation, similar to what you already do under the building code, but this is a higher standard than that. So it's 2 feet in all zones for non-critical actions and 3 feet for critical actions. And any higher standard of elevation that may exist in a community or a state will trump this. So this is the minimum standard under FFRMS. The third is the 0.2% approach. Sometimes we call this the 500 year. So that is using that 0.2% annual chance floodplain elevation to determine what to elevate to. So nature-based solutions are really stressed here, and I know that this has been an ongoing trend and interest in using natural systems, ecosystem processes to develop alternatives where possible. And FEMA does have a couple of guidance documents, and at the end of this presentation, I will send the link in the chat. But very important to incorporate nature-based solutions. As you know, natural floodplain functions are a great way to mitigate. So before we move on to FEMA's specific implementation, I want to talk about what a critical action is, because this is, I alluded to it earlier, but this is one major thing, that there are different standards for critical actions versus actions that are not critical. So these are, if there's an action or activity where even a slight chance of flooding is too great. And some examples of that include, hazardous materials, of course, housing for the elderly or disabled, hospitals, very important to not have your hospital flood during a major flooding event or anytime, emergency operations centers, data storage centers, power generating, etc. Each federal agency may define this slightly different, because I have noticed a slight difference between FEMA's definition and HUD's definition, for example. But in general, this is what this means. And if your project is funded by HUD versus EPA, you'll want to make sure to check their guidance and their implementation to make sure that that you're following exactly the right thing, and that the differences between agencies does make this a little complicated, but we're here for you, and the other agencies also have reviewers for this, so we'll help guide you as best as we can. So we're going to move on to FEMA FFRMS partial implementation. So Karen is going to take over and share the slides. While Karen is doing that, I'm going to continue to speak for one moment. I do want to mention that Karen's going to talk a little bit about our roles, the different roles that she has and I have, but I want to put a disclaimer out there that when FEMA comments on a project, especially when it's not a FEMA funded project, our advice is it's consulting, it's advice, it's general technical assistance. We do not approve development. What I say does not overstep what a local community says, what the city of Boston might say, for example. We're consulting, we're giving advice, and not actually approving any development. So I want to put that disclaimer out there. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And Karen, please take it away.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thank you, Katie, for that. So I'm glad, Katie, you fixed your technical difficulties. I was getting nervous. I was going to have to present your half of the slides too. So that made my day. So thank you. So I'm gonna turn to basically what FEMA has been up to with regard to FFRMS. In particular, I'm going to talk about our partial implementation policies. Let's see if I can do this here. So what we've been up to is, first of all, we've developed several partial implementation policies for several of our grant programs. And I'm going to talk more in detail about each of those policies in just a minute. Secondly, there's a team at headquarters that is currently making updates to our regulations, 44 CFR Part 9. We need to have those regulations updated before we can roll out the full implementation of FFRMS, which is why we're under these partial policies right now. Another thing that's been done is 2 FFRMS specialists have been embedded in each region around the country. So for region 1, that's Katie and myself. So even though we're both focused on FFRMS, our role and our audiences are a little bit different. So Katie's focus is primarily other federal programs and other federal agencies. So as she talked about, there's a lot of different, every agency has policies coming out, regulations are being updated. So there's a lot of coordination with that. So that's Katie's primary focus. For me, my audience is sort of twofold. One is internal to FEMA. So ensuring that our environmental specialists are up to speed on FFRMS. So, knowing how to determine if it's applicable to a project, if it is, what are the requirements, and then how to implement those requirements as well. So our environmental reviewers really need to know the nuts and bolts of FFRMS. On the other side of that is external partners as well. So people that are involved with applying for FEMA grants. So whether it's the project proponent or the states, tribes, et cetera, it's really ensuring that they understand that FFRMS exists and have a basic understanding of what the requirements are. I do have our contact information up on this slide. I'll have it on the very last slide as well. And I think the slides are going to be shared with you all as well. So you'll have that information, but feel free to reach out to us if you ever have questions about FFRMS. If you want to figure out if it applies to a specific project, that's part of our job. We're here to help. So happy to answer questions today as well as moving forward. So the partial implementation policies, as I mentioned, they're in effect. We need to have our regulations updated before the full implementation is rolled out. So for public assistance, there was a partial implementation policy issued in June of 2022. For hazard mitigation assistance, there were 2 policies issued. The first one was in August of 2021, and that was the very first policy. And then it was later revised in late of last year to align it more with the PA policy, which makes sense. We want to have the policies all sort of match up. But the thing to note about this is that just because the policy was updated doesn't mean that the original policy goes away. And I'm going to talk more in detail about the hazard mitigation assistance policies in just a minute. And you'll understand why. I think you'll understand more at that point why I say that. But so the programs that we have to consider FFRMS for are the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, our Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, or FMA, our BRIC program, which is the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And this was the program that took the place of PDM, but PDM did come back. It was resurrected. And so the only program under PDM that exists right now is our legislative PDM program, but you do have to consider FFRMS for those projects as well. Another program is our Grant Programs Directorate, or GPD program. Now, GPD doesn't have a specific policy per se, but they incorporated FFRMS language into the notice of funding opportunities, or the NOFOs, starting around fiscal year 2021 and moving forward. And basically you just follow the hazard mitigation assistance policies. It just refers to the HMA policies. One thing to note, and I know Katie talked about this earlier, was that FFRMS will be extending the floodplain horizontally as well as vertically. Under the partial implementation policies, we only consider the vertical expansion, not the horizontal expansion at this time. That will be down the road. So I'm going to jump into each program and talk about first how to determine if FFRMS applies to a project. And then once we determine, or we know how to determine whether or not it's applicable, then what are the requirements at that point? So for public assistance, for FFRMS to be applicable, the project has to fall within one of the three categories that are listed in that first bullet. So either substantial improvement, repair of substantial damage, or new construction. At this time, it's for structures only. FFRMS under partial policies, it does not apply to facilities at this time. So it must be a structure. It has to either be a non-critical action in the 1% annual chance floodplain, or a critical action in the 1% or 0.5% annual chance floodplain. It has to be a project associated with a disaster declared on or after the issuance date of the policy. So that would be that June 2022 date. There are no program cost-effective constraints with the public assistance policy. And I included this bullet because the original hazard mitigation assistance policy does have some cost-effective constraints, but PA doesn't have that. And if any other higher standard exists, whether it's state, local, et cetera, that higher standard would apply rather than the FFRMS standard. For hazard mitigation assistance, I thought it would be easier to show this in a table sort of policy side by side. So I have the original 2021 policy in the left column and the updated policy in the right column. And so you can see from the first two rows, you'll see what I meant earlier when I said that the first policy doesn't go away. So the original policy applies to HMGP projects that are associated with disasters declared from the issuance date of that original policy to the date that the next policy came out. So that would be December of 2022, as well as all of our COVID disaster declaration projects. And that's kind of key because we have a ton of projects that fall under the COVID funding in our queue right now. I think our HMA program has somewhere in the range of 50 to 80 projects in their queue that they're reviewing. So the older policy certainly does or can apply as long as the other criteria are met. For our non-disaster programs, so BRIC, FMA, PDM, the original policy applies to fiscal years 21 and 22, whereas the newer policy applies to fiscal year 23 and later. Both policies apply just like PA to only to structures, so that stayed the same. The original policy only called out projects that involved elevation, floodproofing, and mitigation reconstruction, whereas the newer policy incorporated language that aligned it with PA, so they added in substantial improvement, repair of substantial damage, and new construction. The original policy only applied to non-critical actions. This was a big difference. And then the updated policy, again, aligned it with PA, and they added in that it could be critical or non-critical. The original policy also had those cost-effective constraint that I mentioned earlier. So it can apply, but as long as that additional, whether it be floodproofing height or elevation height, whatever it is, as long as that doesn't negatively affect the BCA and program cost effectiveness, then FFRMS would apply. And what that really means, I guess on our end is that we would just have to coordinate and communicate with the project proponent, probably through an RFI process that, hey, this requirement exists, please confirm that you would do this, that this is possible. And then we would work with our program staff and our engineering staff, who are the ones that are responsible for program cost effectiveness and in reviewing BCA. So it's just a lot of communication and coordination associated with that. I just had a project recently in Connecticut where there was some floodproofing happening, and they were going to have to floodproof a little bit higher. So that's exactly how we did it. We just reached out through RFI. and worked with our engineering and program staff to make sure that it didn't negatively affect the program cost effectiveness, and it did not, which was great. And to my knowledge, it's the first project that we've had where FFRMS actually, was incorporated into the final project design. So the new policy doesn't have those cost-effective constraints. And then finally, just like the public assistance policy, if any other higher standard exists, that would apply rather than the FFRMS requirements. So for our grant programs directorate GPD program, I mentioned earlier, there is no specific policy for GPD, but FFRMS language has been incorporated through notices of funding opportunities, or the NOFOs, for fiscal year 21 and moving forward. It follows HMA criteria, and to know which HMA policy applies, you really just have to look at the notice of funding opportunity language. The earlier NOFOs specifically call out the 2021 HMA policy linked to it, specifically say it's for non-critical actions only, whereas the updated language, it takes out the non-critical only language and then added in some superseding policies language. So if you see that superseding policies, you know that it's the updated policy that would apply. The sub programs under GPD that have FFRMS requirements right now are listed. I won't read through them all. You can see them on the slide. I will say we had 5 for the longest time, and I just a couple weeks ago realized that the last 2 bullets, the cybersecurity grants, those are new grants as of 2023. And so the NOFOs for 2023 included some FFRMS language. So those have been added to the list. And I will also say that this list is GPD projects nationwide that this applies to. We don't see some of these grant types in Region 1 necessarily. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones are not common in Region 1, but that's the full list anyway. And so that's the applicability. So, that's to determine, does FFRMS apply to this specific FEMA funded grant project? Once we determine that it does, what are the requirements? And so this table outlines what the requirements are. And I will make a note here that I did use 100-year and 500-year language rather than 1% and 0.5%, only because I couldn't fit it on the slide. So I'm going to say 100-year and 500-year for this slide, but I think we're, given the audience, I think I don't need to explain much more. But so for public assistance, if you have a non-critical action in the 100-year floodplain, you'd have to protect to the 500-year or 2 feet above the base flood elevation, whichever is lower. For non-critical actions in the 500-year floodplain, there are no FFRMS requirements. It doesn't apply, and that's across the board for all policies under all programs at this time. If you have a critical action in the 100 or 500-year floodplain, you'd have to protect to the 500-year or 3 feet above the base flood elevation, whichever is higher. So that's for PA. For hazard mitigation assistance and grant programs directorate, I have the 2 policies side by side. The column on the right for the HMA 2022 policy is exactly the same as what I just talked about with PA, so I won't talk too much about that. But it's the policy on the left, the 2021 policy, that I want to point out because there are some differences. So if you have a non-critical action in the 100-year floodplain, you can see the only requirement is 2 feet above the base flood elevation. So they didn't consider the 500-year flood elevation in the original policy, whereas the newer policies consider both. For critical actions in the 100 or the 500-year floodplain, the original 2021 policy did not apply to critical actions. And I do have a note here, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this too, but even though there are no FFRMS requirements, there are other standards that have to be met, whether it's through our regulations, which you have to protect to the base flood elevation or the 500-year flood elevation, or the engineering standards, ASCE 2414, which is 2 feet above BFE or 500-year, whichever is higher. So it's not that there are not further protections for critical actions in the floodplain. It's just that it wouldn't be FFRMS. So those are the requirements for each of the programs. This is just a figure that sort of visually depicts the different elevations with a steep elevation. This came out of headquarters. This is a draft figure. There's a lot of materials, a lot of figures, a lot of guidance that are being developed at headquarters right now. So there'll be a lot of tools that will come out in the near future, particularly to support the full implementation or the full rollout of FFRMS. But I did want to include this just as a visual in there. And then, I've talked solely about the partial implementation only because that's what we have at this time and that's what we're dealing with. But I did want to dedicate at least one slide to the full implementation. We don't know a whole lot about what it's going to look like, and that's mainly due to just the nature of the rulemaking process. They're not allowed to really tell us a whole lot. But I'll tell you what I do know, and I know that it's coming soon. Our regulations need to be updated, and I know the team at headquarters is working really hard and really quickly at getting the regulations updated. The notice to amend the regulations was published back in the fall of last year. And then the notice of proposed rulemaking is anticipated sometime this year. I've heard rumors that it could be this summer. Of course, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, so that could change, but we anticipate it to be published this year. And that should tell us a lot. Once we see that, we'll see what the draft changes are and what the requirements will be. And when that is published, there'll be a 60-day public comment period. So we encourage folks to, check it out, provide comments, ideas, suggestions. I'm certain that I know our group in Region 1 will probably submit comments once it comes out and we get to see the changes. So the final rule is anticipated sometime next year. Again, that date could change, but that's what we're expecting. And again, I don't know a whole lot about what it's going to look like, but what I do know is that it will include that horizontal expansion that Katie talked about earlier, as well as the vertical expansion, which we've talked a lot about today. And it will apply to facilities as well as structures. So right now we're only dealing with structures, but it will apply to facilities as well. And I'm sure most of you know this, but so structures is defined as basically has walls and a roof. It includes mobile homes and storage tanks as well. So that's what we're dealing with right now, but it will apply to so anything without walls and a roof, it'll apply to that as well. And I don't know what the details are on that, but. And so that's all I have. I wanted to put our contact information up again at the end. We're happy to answer questions now, but again, down the road, if you have questions about a specific project or about FFRMS in general, we're here to help.
Thank you so much. That was really all good information, and I'm very glad that we're getting a copy of the slides because yikes, right? So I'm just looking through to see if there are any questions. I see one that I submitted, and it is this. Do you know anything about the rumor that FEMA will be adding a map overlay in the future that will support the climate science approach for the FFRMS?
Katie, do you want to take that one since you're our mapping expert?
Sure. I think that is a route that is being pursued. I think we know that these kinds of projects can be lengthy and expensive. But I think that is something that FEMA would like to do eventually, but I don't know any real details on that because I think it's part of that nebulous rulemaking stuff that they keep close to their chest until it's published.
And I will add to, I have heard that there is a tool coming out. I don't know what it looks like, but that there is a specific tool for the CISA approach that will be coming out as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And then Noah asks, do FFRMS standards affect compensatory storage requirements? Compensatory storage requirements is a Massachusetts regulation through the DEP Wetlands Protection Act. I don't know if there's anybody on the I don't know if that's actually a FEMA question, Noah. I don't know, Katie or Karen, you might want to take a stab at it, but if Rebecca Haney or somebody from DEP is on the call, they could pipe up too.
I will say from a floodplain management perspective that any higher standards apply or any additional standards always apply. So there may be some sort of building standard that is completely unrelated to floods that will also apply in addition to these standards. And I don't see that for example, a freeboard value approach, adding a couple of feet of freeboard would impact compensatory storage requirements. But I'm not the expert on the state level regs, but higher standards always prevail.
Okay, I'm just looking through the list of folks here and I see Rebecca. I don't see anybody specifically from DEP whose regulation is the Wetlands Protection Act.
Joy, I'll also hop in quickly while you're looking around to see who's here, to use that as an excuse to encourage people during this Q&A session to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves so that we can see each other and talk. And I think maybe I'll also stop the recording so that people don't have to worry about their, showing up on YouTube forever, however you happen to look right now. So.
Very